Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 8th episode of the Benko Gambit Speedrun series. In this particular episode, we are going to be playing against players in the rating range of 1400 to 1600. So instead of the usual 100-point rating gap, this particular video is actually going to feature a 200-point rating gap. And in this video, we're also going to be playing 2 games rather than the usual 3. The reason that there's some adjustments with this particular video compared to the other ones is mainly because in the games that I've been playing on this speedrun account, quite honestly, there just really haven't been that many D4 games that I've had the chance to play against, with our opponents starting off with playing the move D4 on move number 1. Hopefully that will kind of increase or kind of go back to normal as we pass the 1600 rating range for the next episode. But not really in my control, unfortunately. If people aren't playing D4 on move 1, then I have to kind of make do with what I've got. That being said, these 2 different games are very interesting, I think. The first game does focus on consolidating a material advantage when our opponent ends up getting a knight trapped in the opening. So we start off ahead of piece. Our opponent does create some counterplay that we have to be careful about. So we have to work towards consolidating that material advantage, which we work on doing. And then in the second game, we are going to see how to punish an opponent who plays the Colle system, but especially playing the Colle system in a suboptimal way. They're going to allow us to get a bigger space advantage in the center of the board, open up the middle of the board, especially the E file, and we're going to be able to get a pretty good attack in that second game. So hopefully you enjoyed the 2 games. Let's go ahead and get right into them. All right, we've got our game here. After D4, we're going knight f6. We're playing against Excellent Guru, rated 1456 from the United States. So our opponent continues with the move knight f3 on move number 2. We are going with our kind of Benko-esque c5 move in this kind of position. They advance up to d5, which is, generally speaking, the best move that white can play here. Grabs more space for them. And we're continuing with our b5 move. So this is what's known as the Spielman Indian. It is a kind of, pseudo Benko Gambit type of position. The main difference with a normal Benko Gambit is that the opponent does not have their pawn on c4 just yet. If white had played pawn to c4 right here, we would have pretty much transposed into a Benko Gambit type of position. But our opponent decides to go for the move knight to c3 instead, which doesn't really feel like all that great of a move because we can simply play the move b4 to attack the knight that's on c3. And the knight is going to have to move away to a less desirable location. Either it's going to have to go back to the starting square, the edge of the board, or if it goes up to b5, which our opponent decides to go for, simply put, this is not a safe move for our opponent to play. The knight actually has no escape squares in this position. Every single one of these squares are protected or defended by one of our pawns or by our queen. And so we can make the move pawn to a6, and the knight is simply trapped in this position. Nothing that white can do here. So they're going to lose the knight. I was going to say maybe their best bet is to give the knight up on the d6 square specifically. It does make it a bit awkward for us to develop the bishop off of the c8 square because now there's these 2 pawns that are kind of stacked up on top of one another. That being said, we can play the moves a5 and bishop a6 to kind of open this bishop up or get it to a more useful location. I don't know if we necessarily need to rush doing this. We could also go bishop to b7 to target the pawn in the center. I think I'm going to start with, let's say, pawn to h6 first. Mainly just to kind of see what white does. If they commit to capturing the knight, that's fine with me. If they don't capture the knight, what we can do here now in this position is kick the bishop back one more time. And then after bishop to b7, targeting the pawn on d5. Now that once we play g5 and our knight's no longer pinned, then it's going to be pretty much impossible for white to defend the pawn on d5 in the long run. And I think we're going to be able to, to win some material here in the center. So I think we can go g5 here. Bishop will retreat. Let's go bishop to b7. And there's no way that white can defend this pawn adequately. If they do play pawn to e4, we can either take the pawn right away, or maybe there's other options that are available as well. But yeah, the main issue is white's just going to lose the d5 pawn. And if the d5 pawn falls, then their entire position really collapses. They are, of course, already down a piece to start off with. But if we get rid of d5, then all of our pieces on the queen side start to wake up. And I think we're in good shape there. So I could take with the knight in this position, but that does release a lot of the pressure on the d5 pawn. I think instead of doing that, I'm leaning towards playing the move queen to e7 instead. with the idea of taking the pawn on e4 with the queen. And once the queen captures on e4, then the pawn on d5 is pretty much doomed at that point. Also, when the queen's on e7, I'm even threatening to take the pawn on d5 right away, since the pawn on e4 would be pinned. So I think here we will just go for that move. I do think taking with the knight right away is also absolutely fine, but I think this might be even a bit more precise. I'm really less focused on winning the e4 pawn and more focused on getting rid of the d5 pawn is what it comes down to here. So I'm going to take with the... I'm not entirely sure. Do I take with the knight on e4? I can also take on d5 with the knight or the bishop in this position, once again, since the pawn's pinned. Let's see. I don't know which one we should go for. I think I'm going to take with the knight. Let's see. Take with the knight. Yeah, because maybe I can play knight f4 afterwards, and then the knight is kind of just in the way of the pieces. I'm happy if white wants to exchange pieces on f4. And now I'm just going to develop the bishop, castle, get the knight in the game. Once I develop the bishop and castle, my king gets out of the center of the board, and then there's zero things for me to be concerned about at that point. And so white would just be in big trouble there. They play the move e5, which to their credit is probably the best move they can try to play in this position. They're really trying to just open up the center of the board ASAP. I think that being said, I think I can take the pawn, and if they take with the knight, there I don't necessarily want to take the knight because then rook to e1 would pin the queen, but I can take the pawn and then just develop the bishop, castle, and again, I'm just up a piece in this position. As long as I can castle and develop, that's going to be good for me here. So I'm not in a rush to take this and walk into a pin. I don't think that works well for me. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and play bishop to g7, get the king castled, and then our extra piece is going to be pretty good in the grand scheme of things. If they take my knight, I will take back. That's one less pair of pieces on the board. Castle the king, develop my remaining knight, and mainly just looking to attack down the middle of the board here. So they move the knight away. I think I'll just go ahead and castle now. It is possible to take the pawn on g2, but once again, they're threatening the move rook to e1 to pin my queen. So my priority here really is just to develop, or mainly just to get the king out of the center of the board. Once our king is safe, then all of the danger is pretty much gone here. I can go for the move queen f6, it looks like. I don't want to play knight to e6 because then bishop d6 skewers my queen to my rook. So queen to f6 looks solid enough. We're also now threatening to take the pawn on g2 at the right time. And otherwise, I'm going to play d5, develop my knight. And again, I'm up a piece as long as I can kind of survive the short-term bit of danger that my opponent can throw at me. The extra material is going to be pretty good in the long run. So they play knight to e5. I would like to develop my knight, but they're going to take the pawn that's on the d7 square, so I don't want to do that. I could play pawn to d6 to simply kick the knight backwards. They probably go back to g4 is my assumption. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm leaning towards d6, I guess. I really just want to kick this knight away from this active location. Probably goes back to the g4 square. And then I'm not sure if I want to take the pawn on b2 or if I want to just retreat the queen back to safety. Taking the pawn seems fine. I don't really see the downside. I think I can get away with grabbing the pawn. I could also have traded on d3. That might have also been useful, but okay, I think I'm going to grab the pawn. It feels kind of unnecessary, I will say, quite honestly. Because then my queen is going to get attacked and I'm going to get kicked around a bit. I think actually, rather than being a little bit overly greedy, I think I'm just going to retreat the queen. Look to develop the knight off of the b8 square next move. They do take my knight. Okay, I take back. I could also redeploy the queen to g5 and try to attack on the king side. Also looks like a reasonable way of doing things. And even a move like pawn to h5, the knight is running low on squares. So they decide to sacrifice the knight for the pawn. I think we're just going to take that. Probably they're going to bring their queen in. But the nice thing is I can bring my queen out to the g5 square. I can block off the check and offer a queen trade at the same time. They pretty much have to go back to h3 because behind the queen is the g2 pawn that I'm attacking. Or they can trade, which we are also absolutely happy about. And now we're just up 2 pieces. Equal number of pawns, but we're ahead 2 minor pieces. And yeah, once all the dust settles here, once the smoke clears, we are just up 2 pieces with a great position. I could throw in the move pawn to f3. I think I'm just going to focus on developing, though. Put the knight on e5. And yeah, maybe now pawn to f3 or take the bishop, different ideas like that. They decide to give up more material. Don't think that's going to work the way they'd like it to. Guess here I can just move the bishop backwards. I can target the pawn on b2 behind the rook. And I might as well just go and activate the rooks here. Let's offer a trade of rooks. I can take the pawn on b2 at any moment. I'm still up my... well, essentially I'm up a full rook and bishop in this position, I guess. Rook and bishop, that's 8 points. White has 2 extra pawns. Yeah, so I'm ahead of rook and a bishop in this position. White definitely doesn't have enough counterplay that they can go for. I'm going to do the move rook to e8. Next move, I can play rook to e5 to try to trade the rooks. They go rook to this square. Here I can just go ahead and check, force white to block with the bishop. And then here I don't even really need to react to the bishop being attacked. I can go ahead and play the move rook takes c2. And if white takes my bishop, I will pin their bishop and pick up the bishop on f1 afterwards. And they end up resigning in this position. So we get the win here. Let's go back and analyze the game. So our opponent goes for a very principled start to the game. They go for d5. They have the knight on f3. We go for b5 here. I don't think knight to c3 is all that great of a move because once we play the move pawn to b4, we attack the knight on c3. Probably white's best move, given the circumstance, is either to go back to the starting square or over to the edge of the board. But if they had played knight to a4, I would have probably just played pawn to d6 to guard the c pawn. And then the knight really just feels very misplaced when it's over on the edge of the board here. If they go back to b1, I might have played maybe just continue with pawn to g6 and focus on developing here. And black is in good shape in a position like this too. The move knight to b5 was definitely a mistake because after a6, we end up winning a knight for free. But that being said, even though we're ahead the knight for free, we still have to... we can't just fall asleep at the wheel and just expect the game to win itself. One of the problems we do face in this kind of middle game, if we're not careful, is that this kind of pawn structure, if white is able to somehow maintain the pawn on d5, it can actually make it very, very difficult for all of our queenside pieces to get in the game. Usually, you would be able to push the pawn to d6 and open up, the d7 square and the diagonal for the pieces, but because the pawns are doubled on d6 and d5, that's not really possible to do. You really have to try to eliminate that d5 pawn in order to fix the queenside. So that's why I played h6, g5, bishop b7. I attacked the pawn on e4. I think I could have also taken with the knight. I think this probably works out totally fine as well. Something like this, and then castle. I think black is also absolutely better here too. But I decided to go queen e7, took the pawn on d5, blocked off their bishop with my knight. To white's credit, I will say, despite them having kind of lost the piece early on in the game, I think white did a reasonable job of trying to create some counterplay and open up the middle of the board. Because I am pretty far behind on development. I haven't developed my dark square bishop and I haven't castled yet. So if white can create enough trouble in the middle of the board, then they can definitely create some counterplay that I have to be careful about. So I took the pawn, played bishop g7. It would have been interesting if he had tried something maybe like taking the knight and then knight to g6. I don't think this works in hindsight. I was a little bit bothered by something like this occurring, but I think we can just go bishop to e5. Yeah, bishop e5 might actually be fine. And then, just move the king away. play pawn to d6 to guard the bishop, and then again we're up 2 pieces. So okay, maybe this doesn't really work for white, but I thought it could have been an interesting idea. He played knight to c4, maybe rook e1 he could have also tried, but I think once again I would have just taken the knight. So he tried knight c4. Now I do have to be careful about rook to e1 here. I don't want to get greedy for material. I don't think I want to do something like bishop takes g2, because now white plays rook e1. If I try to block with my knight, white can take this bishop, white can check with their knight, and all of a sudden white's creating a lot of trouble for me. And I'm not even ahead material. I'm not ahead of piece at least anymore in this position. So the priority here is to castle the king, get out of the center of the board. A lot of the times when you win material in chess, especially if it's in the opening phase, usually to win that material, you will have to kind of go out of your way to pick it up. It's not super common that you'll win material like in flow, like you'll win the material and improve pieces at the same time. That's not always how things work. Sometimes to win material, you have to kind of go out of your way to pick up that material. And once you've won the material, then you usually have to kind of go through a little bit of a consolidation phase where you're ahead the material, which is good, but you still have other problems in your position that you need to fix in the meantime. And that's kind of what we were seeing in this kind of phase of the opening here. I'm ahead a knight. I'm up a piece and a pawn, but I still have some other problems to fix. My king wasn't castled. Now it is. My pieces weren't developed that well. Once we fix those problems, I think it's relatively smooth sailing here. The rest of what we do is, just kind of consolidating further. Of course, if white trades the queens when we're up 2 pieces, we're very happy about that. White tries some sacrifices, but they never really work out, and he ends up resigning the game here. So that's going to do it for this game. Let's go ahead and get into our next one. All right, we got our next game here. After d4, we're going for knight f6, of course. Playing against Can't Stop the A Train, rated 1597 from the United States. They go for e3 on the second move of the game. We're going for pawn to c5. They go for c3. And here we're going to go for the move d5. So essentially here, at least so far at this point, our opponent is playing what's known as the Colle system. I think as I've mentioned maybe in previous episodes, it's essentially kind of like a London system, except instead of the bishop being out on the f4 square, the bishop is back on the c1 square. So there are some pluses and minuses to this. Quite honestly, I would say mostly minuses, though I'm sure that people who play the Colle system would disagree. But the main issue is, the bishop is blocked in. A lot of the times white will play either knight f3 or pawn f4, then knight f3, and they'll try to play around the e5 square. But what I recommend playing against this system is, first of all, beginning with the move knight to d7 to protect our c5 pawn. And then we're going to go for g6, bishop g7, castle, and eventually push for the move pawn to e5. Now here white's played knight to d2, which feels like a little bit of an odd way of doing things in my opinion. Usually white will play the move knight f3. And I think in this circumstance, because white did not put the knight on f3, they are not stopping us from putting the pawn up on e5 already at this point. After the move knight f3, I would not have been able to play e5 right away. But if they're not stopping me from playing e5, I think I will actually just go ahead and play the move pawn up to e5, grab the space in the center of the board. If they take this pawn, I'll take back with the knight and attack the bishop. So the bishop is going to have to move, or I'm happy to take the bishop in that situation. White retreats the bishop back to b1, which doesn't really feel like the best location in the world for the bishop, but okay, it is what it is. Now, the question here is, how am I going to continue my development? I'm leaning towards putting the bishop on d6 just to aim over at the kingside direction. I could also consider ideas of pawn to b6 and putting the bishop on a6, since the bishop that white put back on b1 is no longer controlling this diagonal. The problem with that setup, especially if I do it before I'm castled, is that once the bishop ends up on a6, white can play the move queen a4 check, which would fork my bishop as well as my king. So I don't want to really rush to do that. I really just want to develop the bishop and castle the king. I think I'm going to go for bishop to d6. It seems like the most active location for the bishop to go to. And white decides to play pawn to f4. I don't think this setup is all that great. If white wanted to play pawn f4, they should have done it before they played knight to d2. They could have played pawn to f4 right away in this position, then played knight f3, then played knight d2, and the big difference there is I wouldn't have been able to play the move pawn to e5 as easily. Whereas once I've already opened up the center of the board, it feels like this f4 move is very weakening. The king is a little more exposed, the e3 pawn is unprotected. Of course, I have to move my knight, but I'm going to pick a slightly more aggressive location, I think. I'm leaning towards the g4 square, because right now I am threatening to take the pawn on e3. So white already has to react to this threat, and it's not the easiest threat in the world to defend against. Maybe queen e2, maybe then I can play queen e7 to hit the pawn. I can also castle in this position, and if white tries to attack my knight, I think I even have knight takes e3, and if the queen takes, the rook can go to the e8 square to pin the queen. I think that looks pretty good. So castling is actually an aggressive move in this position, because even though it looks like I'm just getting the king out of the center of the board, I'm very much in a rush to put the rook on the e8 square. Now, if I go there right now, my knight's going to get captured, which doesn't feel that great. But I think I can change the moves around. I think I can just take the pawn first. Once white takes, then rook e8, and then they're going to be in trouble. It is the case where they're not losing the queen completely, because they could block with the knight or the bishop to kind of plug up the e-file. But I would still take the piece on e4 and then be in very good shape there. Okay, so white moved this knight off of d2. They are opening up the attack of the bishop to hit the e3 knight. I think a lot of people's first instinct here would be, okay, I took the pawn, let's just retreat the knight. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that whatsoever. But I don't think I actually need to react to this threat is the main thing. I think I can just take the pawn on f4. Because if white does go ahead and trade pieces and they think they're winning the knight once again, I still have this rook e8 idea, and I think white is still facing a lot of trouble there. Also, if they take the knight, I could even go rook e8 first. Maybe that's potentially available as well. So, yeah, I think I can just take this pawn. And if they take everything, then rook e8. There is the move knight to e5 to block the e-file once again, but I think I can pile up on the knight that's pinned, and white's not really going to be able to defend it adequately at that point. I can play like knight to d7, queen to c7, pawn to f6. I have a lot of ways of attacking that knight that would be pinned on the e5 square. And yeah, I mean, essentially here, white's biggest problem that they ran into in this game is that they allowed me to open up the center of the board when I had more active pieces, when I was able to castle before my opponent was. And I think, simply put, they're just going to be down material in this position without really any kind of counterplay. And rook e8 is coming very quickly. Even if they don't take the knight, I'm still going to play rook e8, and white's going to have a lot of trouble in this position. So, yeah, it does not look good for white to go for. Okay, they take on e3. If I go rook e8 here, I think it is possible for white to give up the queen. And essentially, they would have taken the knight on e3, the bishop on f4, and the rook when it's on e2, and I would have only gotten the queen and I guess a pawn in return, which feels like that would be quite a lot for white to gain, I suppose. So I think I'm just going to take on e3 first, and then rook e8. So rook e8 here. He's going to play knight e5, I assume. So do I go knight to d7 or queen to d6 first? I kind of want to activate the queen. Queen to c7 is also another way of doing it. I think I'll go queen to c7 here. There. The knight's still pinned. Yeah, I think I'm just going to go queen c7. I don't really know if any of these squares makes a big difference, quite honestly. They all look pretty good. I think I'll go to c7. He's going to bring the other knight to f3 to guard his knight, but then here I can go knight to d7 as far as I'm aware, I think. Yeah, I think that this works out for me. Even if white tries to go and counterattack or threaten some kind of checkmate, I can play g6 and block that off. If they try to attack this pawn, I'll take the knight. And if they try to attack this pawn, I'll probably just play g6, and then the knight on e5 will disappear next move. So there's not really much white can do to stop us from taking this. I don't think bishop takes pawn, knight check. I don't think stuff like that works, because, again, the knight on e5 is still completely pinned. And then if I do ever take the knight, it'll come with check at the same time. So I don't think white has enough ways to make a bunch of threats here. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe in hindsight, the queen being on d6 would have been the best because it would be guarding the d5 pawn. Because here, when I go g6, maybe white can take the pawn, but I think we're still in good shape there. Because once we take the knight, we're gonna still be up a couple of pawns, I believe. At least one pawn. But yeah, probably in hindsight, going to d6 would have left this pawn on e5. Um, you know, more defended, you could say. But yeah, white should definitely castle the king here, or take the pawn on d5 and then castle the king. I think in both circumstances, though, once we do take on e5 and they take d5, assuming that they take the d5 pawn at some point, we're still going to be up one pawn because we'll have 6 pawns to our opponent's 5. But in hindsight, it would have been better to be up 2 pawns rather than only being up 1 pawn. So it is what it is. We're going to take on e5 here, and they do take the d5 pawn. And what to do here? Do I want to trade pieces? Do I want to do something different? I think I will trade the pieces. I mean, again, I'm just up a pawn. Bishop e6 would be nice, but it would lose the knight on e5 with queen takes knight. I have to be a little bit careful about some pressure on the f7 pawn. So yeah, I think I'm going to make this trade. I think I'm just going to go for that. He takes with the rook. I'm not sure if taking with the rook is the best, because here I can check with the rook on e1. The rook would have to block. And then maybe I can take the rook or bring the bishop out. And I think getting this rook to the back rank is going to be at least somewhat annoying. If anything, it allows me to trade a few extra pieces. And I think that white's going to be, not in great shape with their trade when we're able to trade more and more pieces. So they play king f2. That was not what I expected, but I suppose it makes some logic. Let's see here. I want to play rook e5, but I think rook takes f7 does not work because queen takes f7 is check. So okay, rook e5 is available. I could also play something like rook h1 and keep this pin, but I have to even be careful about like bishop takes g6 tricks that white could have, like a discovered attack on my rook and attacking f7. So I could also start with bishop e6 first, but then my rook is still going to have to retreat anyway. So maybe I'll just do this to begin with. Okay, I'm actually going to start with this one. I'm going to play bishop e6 to begin with here. Hit the queen. The queen will move away somewhere, and then probably I'll bring the rook back to e5. Maybe I can go to h1 as well. Could be interesting. Goes to g5, okay. So if I go to h1, the question is, does bishop takes g6 work? It looks kind of scary, I will say. So maybe what I will do, yeah, I think I am going to bring the rook back to e5. I could also play queen e5 and trade the queens. Maybe that's the simplest. White's king is a little unsafe, but mine's also a little shaky at the same time. I think I'm just going to trade the queens and try to play with my extra pawn in the endgame here. So I do think I could have played a little bit better earlier to not lose the d-pawn, but okay, I think we're still going to get ourselves into an endgame where we're up a pawn with a good position. Once the queens get traded, I can also bring the other rook to the open file, and I think white's going to be under some pressure there for sure. If they don't trade the queens, then we're going to start to attack white's king pretty quickly. So I think that white kind of has to trade the queens. I don't think there's really another move that's all that great. They could try queen d2, I suppose. But maybe then I will finally... Yeah, okay, so they were playing this. I think I will finally play rook h1. But this is still a little tricky, I will say. If this bishop moves, the nice thing is I am pinning it. If he takes on g6, I don't think there's as much tricks. I think I can just take on h1, or take on a1. And maybe I can play queen h2 and queen g1 check, or start to create some threats. Maybe bishop to c4 and rook f1, something like that could be dangerous. So he plays rook e3. I think that this is going to get him in trouble, because queen f4 check looks like it's already game over. If the rook blocks, I take the queen, since the rook is pinned. And if he moves the king, then queen f1 is checkmate. So I think rook e3 is just a blunder in this position. And yeah, we just get a nice little quick checkmate there. So okay, let's analyze the game. So our opponent goes for e3, not going for c4. We strike at the center, and they play what's known as the Colle system here. Um, as I said during the game, usually white will play either pawn to f4, then knight f3, castle, and then kind of play that position. That's one option. If they do play f4, I recommend playing g6, bishop g7, castling. Sometimes white will try to maneuver their bishop to the king side. Sometimes they'll develop the knight. Sometimes they'll put the knight right into the square on e5. But usually what you'll try to do as black is play around the weak e4 square that white has created. One way of doing this is moving the queen to c7. Let's say they develop their knight. We can play pawn to c4, knight to e8, and you pretty much put the knights on e5, on f6 and d6. You play around the e4 square, and maybe you can even throw in the move bishop f5 to trade off your bad light square bishop for the opponent's good light square bishop. Maybe you can also do this without necessarily having to play c4, but the idea is still the same. You put the knights on d6 and f6, play bishop f5, try to play around the weak light squares that white has. If they do this setup without the move f4, so let's say they play knight f3 right away, I still recommend playing g6, bishop g7, and usually it's a little bit easier to pull off the e5 advance in this case because there's no pawn on f4 supporting that square. So for example, white might play knight to d2, castle, rook here, queen c7, and our game plan is to play pawn up to e5. And yeah, I think it's a position that's a little more pleasant for black because we have a little bit of a space advantage, but objectively it's probably pretty close to being equal. But when white plays the move knight to d2, I feel like this is an inaccuracy. We're able to pull off the e5 move sooner rather than later, and I think that that just gives us a better version of the opening. Because now, now we've beaten white to the punch. We played e5 before they could play f4 or knight f3 to stop it. So then we just focus on developing. We attack the weak pawn on e3. And then essentially here, white starts walking into a lot of danger because their king is still in the center of the board. I guess in hindsight, I mean, they should really not be playing f4. They should play, let's say, like knight f3. Probably here I would trade the knights. Knight takes back, castle the king, rook e8, bishop g4. I have a little bit more space in the center of the board once again. White's bishop on b1 is a little out of the game, it feels like. And the bishop on c1 is still blocked in. So black is definitely a little bit better. But the game goes on, and it's not going to be as bad for white as it was in the actual game that we played. So as things progressed, I was able to pick up material based on a lot of these pins on the e-file. If white takes this, I would pin. Probably has to block with the knight. I would take with my knight. And there's still going to be a lot of danger on the e-file. So instead, they moved away. I took this pawn. After all of these trades, we do get this pin once more. Maybe it was also possible to just like retreat the knight, threaten knight g3, threaten rook e8. That also looks pretty good, quite honestly. But yeah, I think the way I played it was totally fine. Queen c7, I think in hindsight was a bit inaccurate. I probably should have gone to the d6 square to keep the d pawn protected, because the difference is here white's not able to take the d pawn. So I do think I kind of messed up the move order a little bit when I went to c7. So that was a little bit of faulty calculation, I will say. But we still ended up being ahead one pawn at the end of all of this. I think white should have definitely taken with the queen. And then, yeah, we would have played this middle game up one pawn, which is good. But instead, the rook came to the back rank. This started getting very dangerous for them. And yeah, they kind of just walked into a lot of trouble. Probably white should have traded the queens because their own king was a bit weak in that position. Usually when you're trying to decide whether you should trade queens or not, there's a couple of factors that go into this decision. Number one, how safe is your king versus how safe is the opponent's king? I'd say in both cases, neither king is super safe, but I would definitely say that my king, at least at this exact moment, is safer than white's king. No question about that. The second consideration is, how's the material situation looking like on the board? We are up one pawn, and white is down a pawn. So usually, if you're down material, you don't want to trade queens. But I think in this circumstance, the king safety is a big enough difference that the queen trade should still probably be preferred for white. He probably should have traded the queens, but it would still be good for black to be up the pawn, no question. But yeah, keeping the queens on the board ended up being fatal because he got himself checkmated a few moves later. Okay, so that's it for this game. For this particular video, we're doing only 2 games in this rating range of, I think this one's going to be 1400 to 1600. A 200 point rating gap, 2 games. Mainly, this is because it's been a little bit tricky recently to find players that are playing D4 on move 1, quite honestly. I've had some nights where I'm playing a bunch of games for a couple of hours, and either I might get one D4 game or no D4 game. So unfortunately, if that's being the case, it's going to make it a little bit trickier to have as many games in the videos. I'm still going to be looking for games as the rating band continues going further and further up, looking for D4 games to have in the speedrun videos, of course. But if if I'm not getting very many games against D4 as I'm kind of going through the 100-point gap, I'll either have to widen the gap a little bit in a video, or I'll have to cut the games down from maybe 3 to 2 or something like that. But hopefully more people play D4 in future games, and then we're able to get back to doing three games per video. So anyways, though, it is what it is. Hopefully you enjoyed these couple of games, though, and that'll do it for me here. I'll see you in the next video.